Hey everyone, Jacob here. So we're 100 episodes in, and I just wanted to intro this episode a little bit differently and start out by just saying thank you. Whether you've been listening for a long time, all the way since episode 1, or even following me back from my old podcast, the Daniel 3 podcast, or you're newer to the show and you've only discovered in the past, several months, or even this is the first one, and you're willing to hear out this crazy idea. At least it sounds crazy. I think it obviously holds merit. But this idea of biblical anarchy, of this radical commitment to exploring what it means to live as Christians, citizens of the kingdom of God, as sojourners in this world who live with ultimate allegiance to Christ and his kingdom. That's the conviction that I had when I started this podcast. It still drives what I do today. And, I hope it is the through line of all the different interviews I've done, all the live streams I've done, all the solo episodes I've done. And so, yeah, it's just really an honor to have been able to do it for this long. And I just hope that I can keep doing it and that I keep growing, that this podcast keeps growing. And yet, not I, but through Christ in me. And so thank you all for your support, and let's get into it.
If Christ is king, how should the Christian consider the kingdoms of this world? What does the Bible teach us about human authority and what it means to love our neighbors and our enemies? Before we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, let's know what it means to render unto God what is God's. This is the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, the modern prophetic voice against war and empire.
If Christ is king, how should the Christian consider the kingdoms of this world? That question has opened every episode of Biblical Anarchy from the beginning. For now, 100 episodes. And for the past 100 episodes, I've done my best to answer that question, and not just with slogans like Christ is king and no king but Christ and things like that, but by, as I used to say in my old expanded intro, but by showing what it means to live counterculture to the empires of this world, by exploring what the Bible teaches about government authority and human relationships, and what it means to not just love our neighbors, but to also love our enemies. And that's the mission of this show from the time I started till now. I think it's still the heartbeat of what I do. But after 100 episodes, some things have sharpened, some things have shifted, both in style and substance. And then there's been, little bumps and surprises along the way that have been fun. But for today's episode, it's not just going to be going down nostalgia lane. It's also going to be looking forward. And I have a good guest on to talk about all this with, and I'm excited to get into it because I want to just do an overview so that we can kind of take stock and go over everything that we've learned together over the last 100 episodes, but not just about this project, but just, the church, about Christianity, the Libertarian movement, Christian anarchism, and just kind of take stock of where that is and kind of, I guess, like the cultural zeitgeist, and look forward to how we can continue to push that. So we're going to get into it now with the one and only Cody Cook, who, I feel like last time we were on, we called you the perennial guest. I feel like at this point you're almost the unofficial co-host, at least with how frequently you've made appearances.
Well, yeah. Well, I appreciate that you're willing to have me on, and it says a lot about your ability to book other people. So,
no one else responds to my emails, so then I
like to think of myself as the Scrappy Doo of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast.
It's funny. So we did put this together a little bit last minute. Like, I've been aware that the 100 episode milestone has been coming up, and not really sure what I wanted to do with it. If I wanted to make a big hoopla of it or whatnot. It's funny. Like, I've actually done more than 100 episodes, because if you count the green room, I've done over 100. And then I've done bonus episodes. And then I also had my old show, the Daniel 3 podcast. I never got that one to 100. So this is the first time I've done like in one show, I've gotten to 100 episodes. So I think it's it's a nice little neat milestone. I know you guys did a cool over at the Libertarian Christians podcast. You had Jim Papka on for kind of a cool, episode 400 sort of conversation. But yeah, actually, one of the first things I wanted to talk to you about to kind of, set the stage is to kind of like ask you a question about your impression of me, of the Biblical Anarchy podcast, because, we've both been Christian anarchists for a while, and I think we kind of knew of each other before you joined LCI. And I guess not much has changed because like back before that, we used to fight a lot on Twitter. Now we just fight a lot in Signal chats. But maybe it's a little bit more goodwill than in the past. I think when we first interacted on Twitter, sometimes there were, a few fireworks.
Yeah. So the question is, what was my first impression of you?
Yeah. I mean, me, the Biblical Anarchy podcast. It's like because there's a lot of I don't know. I guess there's a lot of other. There's the Anarcho-Christian podcast, which is kind of on a indefinite hiatus. There's Bad Roman. There's what is it? Rival Kingdoms, Rival Nations. Yeah, Rival Nations.
Forgetting Godarchy,
which is also retired now. But yeah, I'm kind of curious.
Going the Christians for Liberty Network before our friend Mike Meharry retired it. So.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Technically part of our. So he's a colleague. Yeah. So I think I first came across you because I was probably looking for opportunities to plug a book that I'd written, I'm guessing, called Fight the Powers. So I was looking for anybody in that kind of libertarian-y Christian space, and even some kind of progressives at the time, because I think at the time Trump was president, so they were still talking like libertarians a little bit. And then I came across you on Twitter, and I don't think we disagreed too much. There were probably the same things we would disagree about now. If you posted anything that seemed kind of pro closed borders, or maybe there were. I think I'm a little more cynical about some on the kind of the libertarian right, kind of new right space, and so there might have been things like that where we disagreed.
Yeah, I remember there was one. There was one post I can remember that stands out where I think I don't remember what it was about, but I attacked Reason for something they published, and we had a little
that's right,
back and forth about that.
Yeah, I remember that now. Yeah. Anyway. So yeah, but I think when I first came across you, it wasn't the Biblical Anarchy podcast yet. It was the Daniel 3 podcast. And I remember at the time, I listened to a couple episodes. At the time, I thought he's kind of green. I think there was some casual swearing, maybe. That's kind of my recollection. And you had Dave Smith on. So it really wasn't, the trifecta, it just wasn't that great. I'm just kidding. But it was, it was good, but it was kind of green, I feel like. And whereas I think, since you've really grown into your role as a podcaster and content creator at LCI, and I think just sort of, matured a lot, and also just, I think, just your I think sense of, think how to approach topics and just kind of the production value and all these other sort of things. I think you've really kind of grown into that position. Like I said, not that it was bad. I don't want to talk you down when I first discovered you or anything like that. But I think it was kind of new. You were trying it out, and it was. Maybe you weren't quite there yet,
Yeah, no, the Daniel 3 podcast was a weird, like looking back, sometimes I'll go back and listen to old episodes, and there's some I did back then that I'm, proud of, but there's other ones where, not that I'm like, I think anyone can so I feel like you should always be able to look back at stuff that you did, and hopefully if you're growing, you kind of look back and go I'm not satisfied with that. Like I feel like I could do better today. But because that podcast was more of a informal, I didn't plan hardly anything. I just went live and sometimes just talked about whatever, just had random people on. And I was trying to do something I think akin to a sort of just kind of like a Joe Rogan free for all, just have conversations with people and not make it I was like, I'm a Christian anarchist, but I'm going to talk with anyone. And it's just that I'm hoping my Christian anarchism just kind of like, it comes out in the conversation, right? Which I think part of me kind of misses that to some extent, but it definitely, yeah, I did used to swear a lot more than I do now. That's a again, a little tangent. I still get, I'm really torn on the whole swearing thing. On one hand, I kind of get, I've kind of like started to police my own tongue more, just because I think it does provide a better witness. On the other hand, sometimes I get really frustrated if like I share a clip of, Scott Horton or Dave Smith, or I'm trying to think of someone you would respect who also swears, but, but like, I'm sure that you can think of people that like, you'd be like, oh, I'll share their content. But then you're like, oh man, but like, he might say a swear word in that. And I wish sometimes Christians weren't so fragile when it comes to that, right? Like to just be like, ooh, this person, used a vulgar word and now I'm going to dismiss everything else they said. Or kind of like clutch my pearls over it.
Yeah, I feel like swearing is one of those things. It's like taking your pants off in front of somebody. Like you have to be careful who you do it in front of. And so I don't. There's nothing inherently wrong with taking your pants off, but you just want to be, you want to be aware of who's around. And anyway, I won't develop that analogy anymore. But it's a little bit like that, right? Where it's like it's just one of those things. I think you have to feel that you're around somebody who's comfortable with it, and that you're reading. But I think I know what you're saying. So, because like when I started podcasting with Cantus Firmus, I picked kind of a vague title. It came from this line that Bonhoeffer had about Jesus being the Cantus Firmus, the central melody, that all of life's other melodies sort of dance around. And I sort of thought, like, okay, that's cool. So then I can talk about anything. And as long as Jesus is the central melody of what we're talking about, then, I can do, stuff about books. I can have a guest come on and talk about their favorite movie and kind of look at it from like a philosophical or theological lens. I can have theologians on. I can talk about politics. And so, but it just became that it wasn't really about anything. And what I've sort of discovered is that most people want like a focus, right? And I think, if I was like a Joe Rogan, somebody who people just sort of were interested in as a person, then I could pretty much go on and talk about whatever I wanted to. But the trouble is you have to have a certain degree of success before people really care about you. And so in the meantime, you have to sort of focus on, okay, what's a topic that I really have some knowledge about, where somebody's going to say, if I want to hear more about this and I want to develop my thoughts here, this will be a resource for me. And so, yeah, but I think one of the big mistakes of anybody who, especially kind of the theologian podcaster, is they just sort of go, I'll just talk about Jesus generally, and people will listen. And it's like, probably not. You have to do something kind of more focused if you want to get people interested.
Yeah. But there's also something about the Daniel 3 podcast, which I don't know if you can relate to this with what you did with Cantus Firmus, but or other experiences you've had, but like it was kind of just my own personal like libertarian Christian or Christian anarchist, like I can't think of the right word for it. Like I guess it was
like a diary, almost like an exploration of like
it was kind of like I set out on like I know these things go together, and I already started to like maybe like Facebook groups and social media, sort of like make those connections, but it's sort of like that, I sometimes get mixed feelings now about citing Jordan Peterson. I still think Jordan Peterson has a lot of useful insights, even though there's, some things that he definitely gets wrong and hasn't fully accepted Christ. But he has this, like the thing he brings up in lectures when he's talking about free speech. And he says free speech isn't just the ability to criticize government, but it's about like how it's important for society and for individuals, because it's how we're able to actually properly think. Because if you don't engage in free speech and put your ideas out there, even your stupid ideas, then you don't grow. And you have to actually like kind of like go out there awkwardly, kind of like learning to ride a bike and you fall down a bunch. It's like when you're kind of trying to seek after the truth of something, a big component of that is going to be, now you got to start talking about it. And sometimes when you do that, and I think that's part of the awkwardness of when I look back on that, I go, there was times where I listened to what I'm saying in those older episodes of that podcast. I go, yeah, I get what I was trying to get at, but I didn't have it quite right. But I can appreciate that, like, over the 90 some episodes of that podcast, I was kind of like setting the foundation for starting to get it right, which now I think I, have it, I don't, again, I think you should always be growing. I never want to be at a place, and like I lean Reformed. I obviously, you lean Anabaptist, but you could probably agree, like, you never want to be like, now I have the perfect, completely solved theology, and I'm sure there's no more mysteries and insights and learning to do there. Which I think a lot of people, unfortunately, in the Reformed circles can do.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Well, so I mean, we've talked a little bit about, I think, things you've felt like maybe you needed to grow on. What as you kind of look back at Daniel 3, the beginning of Biblical Anarchy, what are some things that you feel like maybe that you've sort of held on to, things that were like you were kind of moving in the right direction? I think what's interesting sometimes is to go back and say, like, I've gotten better in this area, or I've dropped this, but it turns out that this was maybe the core, and I didn't realize it at the time. Like, this is maybe, this is something that's kind of developed and maintained. What's something that maybe you felt like you were getting right? I said that the way I raised my voice at the end there, it sounded like I was saying that you got nothing right, but we were talking about things that you felt like you didn't do as well as you should have. But so, like, what's something you look back and you go, okay, yeah, this actually is pretty good. This was moving in the right direction.
Yeah, no, I think something I got right, but I think I've gotten better at expressing it in a more mature way, is trying to shake Christians out of this sort of like, this mentality that Jesus was just this, like, I don't know if it's just a Christian thing. Sometimes it's just like something people believe in general, that like that Jesus was just nice. That that is the most primary aspect that embodied Jesus. That he just went around and was just like, we just need to all be nice to everybody. And I'm not saying obviously that Jesus was mean, but there's sometimes this sort of like this mentality among Christians that to be meek and to be Christ-like means to always at all times be gentle and calm. And I think that is true for a lot of the Christian walk, but I also think that, like, it is okay to, on the flip side, like there are times in life where you have to flip tables, right? And I think my biggest thing always with the Daniel 3, this kind of was what I was getting at with the swearing. Like, my biggest thing was always like, not only are there times to flip tables, but also everything about modern Christianity is you're flipping the tables about the wrong stuff and just kind of like either whitewashing or completely ignoring the stuff you should be flipping tables about. Mainly was things, related to war and human suffering and, stuff like that. So I think the way I used to express it on Daniel 3 was sometimes a little bit rougher around the edges. But that's still, I think, a core of what I like. I think that fundamental impulse I had was right, but I think I've, as I've matured as a person, as a father, as a husband, and in my theology, I've found more sophisticated ways to express that.
Well, that is something I think about, is like, I have a tendency, I think, to kind of highlight things in sort of a sarcastic way. And there have been times where I've sort of pulled back or tempered that because, I think you want your speech to be, as friendly and accessible and Christ-like as possible. But you also have to sort of take into account, I think some people use like, oh, well, Jesus flipped over tables. And then they sort of use that to excuse just being a jerk all the time. And,
yeah.
But like at the same time, like there is this sort of like thing where like, somebody may get upset about, oh, are you using language in a really gentle way or whatever, you need to speak more Christianly. And then they'll be like, yeah, I think it's okay that they're bombing kids in Palestine. It's like, okay, well, then obviously your opinion about this doesn't matter that much. So yeah, I think that's, maybe it's one of those things for me as a pacifist. I sort of feel like, well, if I'm not supporting killing anybody, then I can just talk a lot of smack and that's okay.
Well, it's kind of like, I don't know if you've seen on social media today, this whole, basically the time we're recording this, by the time this comes out, it'll be a little dated, but the people sharing clips about tapes of, not so flattering videos of Glenn Greenwald and, doing some things of a sexual nature, which are, I guess, people would call it, degenerate and things like that. And yeah, it's sinful or weird and degenerate. And it's not that I look at and like everyone's super outraged about that. But Glenn Greenwald's also like, a fairly good reporter who is, I think done a really good job at exposing things about war and empire and the corruption of our government, even though he's not a libertarian, he's more of a lefty. Well, and it's like people are so outraged about that.
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, but like, that the people who have drudged us up and are going after him are doing it, not because they actually really care about his sexual degeneracy. It's because they hate that he calls out, people for, engaging in mass, human killing campaigns.
Well, and where is that criticism coming from? Because is that like coming from MAGA? Or is it just like sort of Zionists that are also really sort of conservative?
It's coming from both kind of like the neoliberal side, and then also like the uber like Christian nationalists. Like even like Andrew Wilson was like, why is everyone defending Glenn Greenwald? This is just super degenerate. And I'm just like, I'm sorry. Like if you think to be a Christian means that I should be not only like equally offended at sexual degeneracy and like, the mass slaughter of human beings in a war, but even that, like, why do I need to even be out? Like, it's not that I'm trying to say what is sinful isn't sinful, but just like, there's just a difference. There needs to be a difference in our emphasis, like where we place, like, saying like, you can be like, okay, that's uncomfortable. That is sinful. I don't want to see it. I don't want to promote it. Okay. But like, what should get, like, if there's going to be something that gets your blood boiling, maybe it should be little kids being, blown up by government for no reason.
Well, I think it also has something to do with like, what can you do about it? So like, to me, if you're not inclined to like, want to put Glenn Greenwald in prison for sodomy or something, then like, like if you don't want to punish him or whatever, then like, why do you care? At a certain point, like, why do you care? Like, I understand like saying like, well, this is our moral position, but it's like, it's like going around being upset that, Taylor Swift is, sharing a house with the football player guy, Travis Kelce. It's like, I mean, I guess that's wrong, but like, why do I care exactly? Why should that take up like a significant amount of space in my in my outrage meter or whatever?
Exactly.
Yeah. Did you ever if you want to flag the time so you can bleep it, I'm going to quote a swear word in context, if that's all right.
That's fine.
So there's a line that Tony Campolo used to say when he would sort of speak at like Christian colleges and schools and stuff. He'd say, I have 3 things I'd like to say today. First, while you were sleeping last night, 30,000 kids died of starvation or diseases related to malnutrition. Second, most of you don't give a shit. What's worse is that you're upset with the fact that I said shit than the fact that 30,000 kids died last night.
Yep, I've seen that.
Yeah. And I think, you're right. It's just this question of like you can be offended at something that you feel is wrong, or maybe it's something that is wrong. But there is this sort of question of like, just because I guess I think statists have this problem in particular is that they feel that they can't really distinguish between like immoral behavior that warrants a response, like a physical response, like some kind of coercive response or like the force of law, versus like immoral behavior that's like, well, that's wrong, but ultimately it's your decision to make. Like, I'll tell you why I think it's wrong. And I think we should, like, I don't think we should have like a complete, laissez-faire attitude. Like we should in the political sense, but maybe not like in the, like in the moral sense. Like from the pulpit, I wouldn't say, I don't really care. You know what I mean? But
right. There's a big, exactly. Like, so like if Glenn Greenwald was like going to my church and I was a pastor, then I'd be like, okay, I need to have a sit down with Glenn and, in gentleness, but in, truth, talk to him about his sin. But that's again different. There's one is like a relational thing, and I'm not even saying you should have it's okay to look at sin and have a reaction to it. But if you're outraged about Glenn Greenwald's clips being shared and not about the other stuff, then I think there's something imbalanced about what your heart is oriented towards in terms of the moral outrage. And as you said, and I mean, you kind of you said well, if you don't want to, use force or coercion to stop people, it's like, well, there you go. There's a lot of people who that is what they want to do, or at least for the neoliberals, they're just like, oh, well, this will discredit this guy who's calling, out our wars and stuff. So, they'll jump on that bandwagon anyway.
Sure. Yeah, it's like gay people can't make good observations unless they're Milo Yiannopoulos or something. So, looking back a little bit, thinking in terms of episodes that that you sort of stick out as ones that you're really proud of, or ones that maybe have you gotten any significant backlash on an episode, or really high praise on one that sort of sticks out?
Oh boy. So definitely once October 7th happened and I started doing some more episodes on Israel, those got a little bit of backlash from some folks.
Yeah. Well, no, your position was that October 7th was CGI, right? That wasn't real.
Yeah.
Am I remembering that right?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Bush did October 7th. Is that it?
Good grief. I mean, yeah, it's too bad that what are the Google video stuff didn't exist then like it does now. Blame it on that. So yeah, I got backlash for that. I don't know if there's any other episodes I can think of that got tons of in terms of the number, like a lot of negative. Well, no, I did do. So we're talking about sexual degeneracy. I did do an episode, which is, I regret this happened, and people will not believe me when I say this, but I say this, and I promise it's true, that I did an episode called "How Does Sexual Degeneracy Lead to Tyranny?" And it was episode 69, which is just an unfortunate happenstance. But that episode got a lot of angry YouTube comments, which is funny because it was a bit of a provocative title, but I was just basically because I get, and this kind of reflects what we're talking about. I think there is a place, whereas we as Christian libertarians can talk about how it is, there can be negative effects to when sin gets normalized in society, and that can even have an impact on the growth of the state in society as well. There can at least be a correlation there, a little bit of a relationship. But then in terms, but then what's your solution for solving it, right? And how do you even understand how that problem evolved? I was kind of comparing it to there's a part of our culture which reminds me, everyone talks about 1984. I think a much more accurate book about the sort of society we have sometimes been moving towards is Brave New World, where everyone is sort of they're not aware of the tyranny they live under because everyone's just so sedated by sex and drugs and just all that. And so
which I mean, I think makes sense because 1984 was an allegory about Soviet Russia. And Brave New World was just Aldous Huxley looking at the West,
right,
and saying, "Where does this go?"
Right.
Yeah,
exactly. So, and so, yeah, that episode got a little bit of backlash. There was one episode where I got a bad review on I think it was at Apple Podcasts. I can't remember which episode number it was, but it was an episode where I was talking about the parable in the vineyard, which I think is Matthew 20, 21. And I was using that parable to talk about how there's a lesson in here which has some overlap with kind of the Austrian school in terms of where value comes from and how value is subjective. So I was kind of using it as a springboard to critique like the labor theory of value. And the bad reviewer clearly had like a more like left like was a in favor of labor theory of value, was more of a lefty, because they a lot of their comment went on about the exploitation of capitalism and things like that. But then also they critiqued my approach to how I interpreted the passage, which I thought was like maybe a little bad faith, but had a kernel of truth, because like that was an older episode, and I perhaps, and I've gotten better about this in newer episodes, where I try to make sure that like I talk about how passages have like multiple interpretations in terms of like there's like layers, right? Like so there's there's like when you're reading like the Old Testament especially, right, you'll have layers where like there's the actual story that happened, right? Then there's like what are the moralistic lessons we can take from the actors in the story. Like if you're reading through 1st and 2nd Samuel, you're like, okay, what's the lesson here from watching and contrasting King David versus King Saul, right? Then there's like the, more Christ-centered hermeneutic. Like, how does this point forward to Christ? How does this fit in redemptive history? Things like that. So, and then there's, like secondary lessons I think you can take sometimes, where like there's a worldview that the Bible gives, and we can derive, logical conclusions from the worldview, but we should, be careful to sometimes like not be like, hey, this passage doesn't, like, it would be wrong to say that the parable of the vineyard was put in the Bible to teach us about Austrian economics, right? But it was more of a like, hey, this is about how it's ultimately about the kingdom of God, right? And how like it doesn't matter when, and it has a lot to do with about like the grafting in of the Gentiles, and that we don't come to this through our own works, but that it's the grace of God and His gift, and a lot of the parables about the kingdom of God are emphasizing that sort of nature, that it's upside down, the first will be last, and that kind of stuff. But I think it's also fair to like look at it and say like there are things in those parables and teachings which have secondary lessons. So, yeah, those are the ones that come to mind in terms of notable instances of people making angry comments to me on YouTube or Apple.
Well, every so often I'll hear one from you, and that'll either send you a positive or skeptical response. But I think it's been pretty friendly though.
Yeah, I mean, overall, I get mostly. Actually, it's funny. The most recent episode, I've gotten negative feedback, but it's ironic because what happened was I made my title too. So, the latest episode, at the time of recording now, is episode 98, and the episode was aimed at answering the question of like, why do I talk about Israel so much? And so I made the title "Why Israel Matters So Much for Christians," or why the relationship between Israel and Christian matters. And the problem is a lot of people are commenting it and going like, "Oh, but it doesn't." Like, and like they're like Israel is just a state, and it doesn't have anything to do with ancient Israel, and Christians don't owe their allegiance to Israel. And I'm like, if you listen to the episode, you might like what you hear. Like people were almost assuming, the title meant that I was like a Christian Zionist, which is not what I am.
Well, the benefit though is that even those negative comments might raise it in the algorithm a little bit, because it shows engagement, right?
Yep.
So that's good. you win either way. That's good.
Exactly. Yep. So yeah. I had a question for you. In terms of like, I've through my podcast name being Biblical Anarchy, and I think I've talked about this on the show before, but like the title was a point of slight contention when I joined LCI, because I think there was a worry that like, is the word anarchy going to turn too many people off? And I tried to be like open-handed about it to a point. I would say I was like closed fist, but I was like friendly about it. I was like, listen, I really want this, but if you try to pry my hand open, I won't fight you too much, right?
Just call it the Daniel 4 podcast.
Yeah. But ultimately, like, I made the case for why I thought it was important, because I was like, I think it's a conversation starter, right? Like, as people hear the title and they're like, what? and so they, like, even if they come in angry, like, then my hope is that they listen and, maybe have the worldview challenged a little bit. But since then, now it's weird, like, since you've joined, now we're publishing books with the word anarchy in them, and Libertarian Christians podcast now all of a sudden has a bunch of episodes on the history of anarchy and stuff like that, and Christian anarchism, which is cool. So I wanted to ask you, a little bit about that, since you've joined the LCI team, both as a writer and also sharing co-hosting duties with Doug. Have you gotten any, like, first of all, was it always the plan that you were going to join and like push this, sort of like like, we're going to raise the awareness of anarchy? And have you gotten any blowback from our more minarchist or God forbid any constitutionalist audience members we have?
So I'm not aware of any blowback. I think my presence at LCI has barely been noticed, and but yeah, I mean, I'm not really aware of any major. I mean, I've had people find me through LCI and follow me who are positive, or I think the sense that I sort of get, and I didn't really realize I was doing anything controversial necessarily by talking about anarchy, like for a couple of reasons. I think partly because it's in the that larger libertarian sphere, right? So, if I were sort of saying that the only way to be a libertarian was to be an anarchist, that would be different. But I think the other thing too is, I think Christian anarchism is a little bit complex, because when I say Christian anarchism, I could be talking about sort of anarchism in more of like a separatist sense, like kind of almost like an agorist kind of way, which is a little bit more like how, like, I thought a lot of the Anabaptists kind of did it, right? But it also could be kind of a more like activistic kind of anarchism. But as for like kind of pushback, it's funny you kind of mentioned that, because when I was working on the Anarchist Anabaptist, I was working on it before LCI picked up the book. And Doug said, we may want to change the name. So how do you feel about that? I said, I really like the name, and I've got a cool graphic already of like the street anarchist throwing a peace bomb, and it doesn't really work if we change the name. But if you guys want to publish it, I'm open to it. And but I think even there was even a kind of early on, I said, hey, if people like the book, maybe this could be like its own kind of little separate podcast and the Christians for Liberty Network. And I think it was Doug who said something like, we've already got one podcast that has anarchy in the title. So if it makes you feel better, you don't think of yourself as getting a cold reception and me getting a warm reception. Think of yourself as smashing the glass ceiling of anarchy at the Libertarian Christian Institute, because you led the way so that I could write.
I was a pioneer.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah, so that's how I would think of it. But yeah, but I don't think I've gotten a lot of significantly negative feedback. And even like I said, as an interviewer at LCI, I may have guests that I want to push or topics that I think are worth discussing. But like, I'd shared an interview with Alexander Christianopoulos, who wrote a book on the history of Christian anarchism. And, I wasn't necessarily saying this is the perspective everybody should have. In fact, I disagreed with him on some things, because he's a little bit more of kind of an anarcho-communist who's maybe lukewarm on orthodoxy, but he's a historian of the movement. And so to me, it seemed like a relevant conversation to have. And that's, I think, largely what I'm interested in. I think some of the most pushback I've gotten was during our debate on Christian pacifism. I think it's the most critical responses that I got. Just mean and hurtful things that made me cry. And that was just from Carrie. But there were other people who said things too that wasn't as bad. But
takes a lot of courage to bully a pacifist.
Great comment. I'll hold on.
Well, it's funny you bring up your interview and sort of I can't pronounce the guy's last name. Yiannopoulos, you said.
Christo Yiannopoulos.
Yeah. So, and you also talked a little bit about this on a recent episode. I think it was episode 407, where you were talking about your other book, The Pocket Anabaptist. But that there is sometimes a tendency in Christian libertarian circles to an extent, but I think especially in Christian anarchism, both now and maybe in history, where, and maybe even in the pacifist and Anabaptist strains, maybe to some extent too, maybe not as much, but where these, Christians who embrace anarchism or nonviolence to various degrees have sometimes had this issue where they read the Bible, especially the Old Testament, and don't know what to do with it, or are uncomfortable with it. And then that can be a catalyst, along with other things, right? Some of it is like people reacting to maybe their evangelical, like fundamentalist upbringing and doing deconstruction. But for whatever reason, multiple different streams there can be a drift into bad theology or just kind of like outright denial of maybe like historic orthodoxy. Like, what are your, you talked a little bit about this with Doug, like I said, but like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, in your experience and sort of like how you've avoided that, and, why you think it isn't necessary to project orthodoxy to be a Christian anarchist.
Yeah, I think if you come to the Bible with a motive, you're going to end up abandoning the Bible. If you maintain that motive, if you don't let the Bible change you. And so, I've been thinking a lot about this. They talk about a lot of young men returning to church, and I'm really interested in seeing how that, phenomenon shakes out and breaks down demographically and stuff. But the sense that people sort of have is that this is kind of a like an Andrew Wilson-y, kind of Jordan Peterson-y, that kind of right wing. So some would say toxic masculinity perspective, and that they're looking at Christianity because they see it as it's kind of like part of the trad movement, right? Like, we're rejecting modernity, so we're going to go back to this other thing. And they're coming at Christianity with these preconceived notions about who God is, who Jesus is, and what manhood is, and all these things. And so, my hope is that insofar as people are coming with anti-biblical perspectives, that the Holy Spirit is working and is going to catch them up to speed and is going to sort of change them on that. But what can sometimes happen is somebody will come in because they have another motive, and so whether it's like that kind of biblical masculinity thing, or if it's like sort of Jesus, gentle, meek, and mild, that kind of, the nonviolent Jesus. And the problem is, Jesus is, I think, nonviolent. At least his first coming on earth, and Revelation's a little more complicated, but also he's the judge of humanity. And there's some passages that some people would say wouldn't define them as violent. Like, some people about Revelation and they say, well, the sword is metaphorical or whatever. It's like, yeah, but he's still judging and killing, right? I mean, that's still part of the thing. So you can call that nonviolent if you say, well, the sword's not literal, but there's an element of destruction to that, right? And so, like, I think what happens is people come with this preconceived notion, and then that is the center of their faith. It's not Jesus as he is. It's this other thing that I'm coming in that I'm hoping Jesus will support, right? And so they're looking to Jesus to back them up. And then when Jesus doesn't, at every point, they say, well, maybe that's an interpolation, or maybe that's not as inspired, or maybe that's not Jesus as I see him. That's not, they'll talk about a Jesus-centered hermeneutic, and they'll say, if Jesus didn't say it, or if Jesus did say it, but it doesn't sound like this other thing Jesus said, then we're pushing that out, right?
Right.
So I think that's really the danger that people have sometimes coming into Christianity, wanting it to be something and wanting to use it to support some other mission that's really their gospel, that's really their center.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. I think I can't, sometimes I rail against that too hard, but I guess I need to have more sympathy because I wasn't always very orthodox in my beliefs. I used to actually I remember when I first like joined the anarcho-Christian Facebook group when I first became an anarchist. I was still very unorthodox. I didn't believe that the entire Bible was the inspired word of God. I was a Trinitarian, but I don't think I really had a complex view of the Trinity. So like if you would have asked me to define the Trinity, I probably would have like accidentally cited modalism or some other Trinitarian
analogy.
Yeah. And I forget who said that. I always love this quote. I forget who said it. I don't know if it was Hodge or someone. That's like when I finally got done polishing off the finishing touches of my heresy. It was orthodoxy.
It was Chesterton. I quote it all the time because that was my story. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's kind of like, I feel like if you go seeking to just reaffirm the worldview you have, then yeah, you can, there's endless amounts of ways to do confirmation bias. I think that was part of what I did with the Daniel 3. I was like, I'm really convinced there's a connection here, but I want to actually find the truth. And I think, and there's some good people in the anarcho-Christian group who gave me resources to read just about explaining why the Bible is reliable and trustworthy and, things like that. And not only that, I began to also kind of have this conviction, at the very least, if I want more people to see this connection, I should try to argue it from the Bible and not just from the whole Bible, right? If you can, I think I set out saying if I can actually defend Christian anarchism from the perspective of someone who believes the entire Bible is the inspired word of God, that just makes my argument stronger. And I think doing that then was also part of what I just, looking into that is part of what then convinced me of probably the parts of orthodoxy that I, hadn't quite incorporated yet to some degree, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you have to reject part of Scripture to argue for your position, then it's probably not biblical. Right?
Well, there's something about the ones who are really down on the Old Testament too. There's two things. There's being down on the Old Testament, and then there's some who hate Paul. But the Old Testament ones, I think it's especially how do you contextualize who Jesus even is without the entirety of the Old Testament, which is not just maybe they'll accept the prophets pointing to Jesus, but I'm that we don't just have the prophets pointing to Jesus, right? There is so much in the Old Testament, even going back to Genesis, that's pointing forward to Jesus. And I just feel if we're going to say Jesus is the foretold Messiah of the, of the Jewish people, of the, the of the people that come from the covenant with Abraham, then it just I don't know. I don't know what those people do to hold on to who Jesus is in terms of even being that foretold Messiah, right? Which I guess and that gets into I don't even know. I know that's kind of was it Marcion was the one who kind of had a weird view of the Old Testament, and I don't even know what his answer was to that, other than embracing some weird Gnostic Jesus and not the actual biblical one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so here's a question that I've got for you. Is there anything, any issue where you're in trying to be sort of orthodox and biblical, where you have that has pushed back on something that you may have explored in libertarianism, an idea or perspective, or is something where you sort of said, okay, well, if I were coming at this as a secular person, I might follow this rabbit trail, but as a Christian, I can't really do that. Have you felt that tension at times between certain forms of libertarian anarchism and your Christianity?
Oh yeah, I had a hard time accepting the doctrine of hell, and I think I always, for a while, even after I became Reformed, I was I forget how I put it. I was I'm an optimistic reformed. Like I hope universalism is true. Like I not like universalist, like all religions are true, but just like universal reconciliation, right? And then I kind of like let go of that. But I was like, but I don't know if there's hell. Like maybe it's just annihilationism, which I think annihilationism can fit within orthodoxy. Some people might say it's hetero. I don't think it's heresy. It's at worst heterodox, but I kind of think it can be considered within the canon of what's like acceptable orthodox views. But even like annihilationism is still like, it's still God judging, right? Like, so whether it's, eternal, I think eternal conscious torment is kind of a cartoonish doctrine, not exactly the even historic one, but like whether it's some version of hell or annihilationism, like that's still God judging sinners, as you said, and I think that's sometimes that can be uncomfortable for us sometimes, right? But I think that it, to some extent, it just, as I've matured in my faith and just realized how much, and I don't know, I'm speaking from my Reformed worldview, I guess, but maybe you can find some Anabaptist overlap with this. Like, as the more I realized, just in my own personal faith journey, how much like I thought that I was a good person, but then like the more Christ is working through my heart, and I go through more sanctification, the more it's kind of like the more. So like you're not saying like the more I know I don't know. That's how sanctification is. Like the more I'm sanctified, the more I realize how much more I need to be sanctified. And so then I kind of.
It's like when you start cleaning your house, right? And you start to discover that it was a lot dirtier than you thought, and there's mold spots up here, and
right. So then you realize, like, oh wow, like without Christ, I was like utterly in rebellion against Him, and the wages of sin were death, and
or eternal conscious torment,
or right. At the very, and then the other thing is like, but I think there's also part of this. Because like there's the problem of evil as the objection to God, but I've always found that one, like, if you're going to object to evil, I don't know, like, wouldn't it be depressing to be like, God can't be real because there's evil, and therefore there is no God, so all the evil of the universe just goes unaccounted for? And I'm like, no.
Well, it's not even evil, right? Yeah, and in recent years, I think the emotional problem of evil has hit me more. That might be just being a parent, maybe.
Sure, yeah.
But there's a distinction, of course, between that and the intellectual problem of evil. The intellectual problem of evil, I agree. I mean, once you start saying, well, there can't be a God because evil exists, like, okay, well, then evil doesn't exist. So,
right.
but like, just I think the weight sometimes of, there are, children suffering in horrible ways, and no one is helping them. Right. Like that I think is like that weight of that, I think is really is weighed on me in a different way than it used to, I think, probably as a parent,
Right. But I think that speaks, and then it's like, I agree. And I think that's like circular, because then it points you back to like, God, that would be so depressing to live in a universe that's just, there's just all this evil, and it's like, it's pointless and it goes unanswered for. Whereas like with what Jesus did on the cross, I can have comfort in knowing that either like all the evil has been accounted for, because either those who aren't in Christ and those who, don't repent of their sins and have committed all these evils, that like, even if it's not perfectly solved in this life, that, on the final balance, God is, a God of justice. But then for those who have sinned and done evil and do come to repentance, like I still, and I don't know how much the Anabaptists embrace like the full blown, like, penal substitution model, but like at least some, there has to be some, I think all Orthodoxy has to accept some, some aspect of the atonement where there's like, the penalties of sin were paid for by what Jesus did on the cross. So in some way, God's justice is reconciled with His love and his mercy, right? And so the problem of evil, like, yeah, the emotional side, totally get that, especially as a parent. But it can also like strengthen my faith, knowing that like I know that all of this does fall in God's hands, and it has that libertarian upshot of like it's in God's hands. I think sometimes people like look at all the evil in the world and then they feel like it's up to us to fix it all, which can kind of fall, that then you can kind of fall into a statist trap of like, you need the state to fix all the injustices in the world, right? Sometimes the left falls into that with justice, right? Where they think like not just injustice, but like inequality and things like that. Like these things have to be rectified. And the right does that with sin and degeneracy. And I just go, no, like you're right. Like the left and right are both right that like there is almost no bottom to how degenerate and depraved humans can be, and there is almost no bottom to how evil and unjust humans can be. But that's why we put our faith and trust in God. And I'm not a full-blown pacifist, but God says vengeance is mine. So that ultimate divine justice, I trust and give to Him.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe one more thought on the problem of evil. I mean, I go back a lot to maybe this is the kind of the Moltmannian in me, but the existential weight of the cross, right? That we don't have a God who's sort of up there, who's detached, that whatever sort of suffering or despair that we feel, He actually took it on. He felt it. And so that, God is more like, we want to emphasize God as king, and that's certainly biblical, but there's also this sort of sense that God identifies with the suffering, in a more real way, maybe, than He would like a monarch or an emperor, And that I don't know, that says something to me about, I think, my the fact that I should withhold judgment with my limited perspective right now, right? The fact that there's a God who would do that means that maybe suffering is not, the end of the story. That there's more to it than that.
Well, not only that, but I think there's I remember I used to go like Christian summer camp when I was a kid, and you would get everyone would be divided into groups, right? There'd be like a group would be called Benjamin, another one would be called Gideon, and like all the games and contests and whatnot got you points for your team, and so like at the end of the week, the team with the most. Think like Harry Potter with all the different houses, right? But in a Christian camp setting. And something you could do to get points was memorize scripture verses, but like they had to ban certain verses that were like, super short, like in John 11, like Jesus wept. But so like I grew up having this like comical view of Jesus wept because I'm like, oh, it's the shortest verse of the Bible. And like, as a kid, not really thinking anything of it. Then as an adult, like, when I really like read that passage and let it hit home, like Jesus is on His way, being told that Lazarus is dying, and he already told them he's fine, he's just going to be sleeping, like, like nothing to worry, but like, and then hears that he dies, and like Jesus is so moved by the sorrow, like the condition of human sorrow and suffering, that He weeps, even knowing that He is going to raise Lazarus from the dead. And there is just, I don't know that there's enough words to in any human language to like really describe the depth of what you're getting at. That like Jesus, like what were those commercials that like He gets us that played during the Super Bowl, and like maybe they sound a little bit cliche, but I'm like, yeah, that is an important element of the Jesus story, that like He did walk as a man, and He came down and was God our brother, and he knows what we're going through. And we can find hope not just in that, but in that He's overcome it. So,
well, this is your show, so I can't determine when it ends, but I do know that we're pushing up against an hour,
yes.
And so I've got a couple questions, and then if you can go on from there because you're the host and that's your prerogative. But if you've got anything after this, you can keep moving. But so my maybe I'll give them to you both at once. One is thinking about the diversity of LCI. And, we've got the Reformed Libertarians podcast. We've got the Protestant Libertarian podcast. Alex Bernardo, Methodist, grew up Catholic, but he's kind of in that broadly Protestant space, but also sort of ecumenical. and then Reformed Libertarian podcast obviously speaks for itself. I'm Anabaptist. And then you're in this place as sort of a Reformed Baptist where you get crap from the Arminians for being Reformed, but you also get crap from the Reformed for not being really Reformed.
Right.
And so, I wonder, what you think about LCI's approach to kind of maintaining this kind of diversity within the ranks. To be the libertarian Christian in the broad sense, institute. And do you feel like that helps our message, or do you feel like sometimes it's not worth it because of disagreements that can arise? And then, maybe just sort of one of these kind of easy questions, I suppose, softball questions. You've done 100 episodes of Biblical Anarchy Podcast. What do you want to do for the next 100 episodes?
Yeah. No, I've always loved even when I joined, there was a diverse, set of people here, and it's only grown from there. I still, hope one day we get a Catholic or even maybe an Eastern Orthodox person to join the ranks.
If Mike Meharry would bring back the Godarchy podcast, he's Eastern Orthodox. So
okay, yeah.
He's in the group chat, but he just hasn't really said. I don't know. That kind of counts. I feel like.
Right. Yeah. It's.
No, I agree. It would be great
technicality, but yeah. No, I think it's it's good. Like I always try to, I always. So it's kind of hard to not talk from my theological perspective, but I do try to put in the effort to also then present my arguments in ways that I think would make sense for people from other, Orthodox Christian theological, considerations, right? I think we've talked about this before, either in podcast or in private, but I generally think each denomination or theological or philosophical camp within Orthodox Christianity has an important grasp on something that's fundamentally true. Even the ones where I think they get a couple things wrong, I go yeah, they get a couple things wrong, but the couple things that they get right, they generally might do those things better than a lot of other camps. I've heard you say this about even Reformed. You say, Reformed, for all their flaws, they do systematics really well, and you wish that the Anabaptists did systematics better.
Well, or even sometimes I feel like a tradition could get something ultimately wrong, but at least they're talking about it. And so that's part of the conversation. I think that the Reformed are ultimately wrong about what God's sovereignty looks like, but they're talking about it. They're interested in it. And a lot of Christians aren't. And so the fact that they're part of the conversation is really important. And to me, I think, it's sometimes, Christianity is an emergent phenomenon. It's not necessarily, this group has it right or this group has it right. But as we talk together and we sort of communicate, we think about history and we think about, different places and different traditions with Christians in them, that what sort of comes out of that is almost bigger than the parts, right? The whole is bigger than the parts. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you in your answer.
No, that's good. That was a good addition. But yeah, no, I think, I could go on about that that could almost be a whole podcast. But yeah, I think there's different things I've learned from Catholics and their scholastics and their approach to philosophy. There's things about the Eastern Orthodox and their, ideas on theosis, and they're more kind of mystical, things, their views on salvation. I disagree with how they view the distinctions between salvation and sanctification, but they have a different, they have an emphasis that's almost, if there was anything that's going to be the exact opposite of the Reformed soteriology, it's pretty much Eastern Orthodox. But I can listen to them and appreciate it, and I think it makes my view more well-rounded, right? And I hope that's what we do here at LCI, is we kind of round each other out, and we're able to present a more, one, there's just the basic, diversity of people join and go oh, I can find Reformed Libertarians. Oh, I can find, Cody and Anabaptists, or, Norm with Church of Christ. And that's why I kind of I wish we had a Catholic, so that, it's funny that I have actually some really good Catholic friends who like watch the show a lot, so I always try to be very courteous to the Catholic faith. I wish we had a Catholic so that like people could go like, oh, I want to go hear what the Catholic libertarians are saying, and to have that as a resource for when I'm talking to Catholic statists. So I think we're doing really good there. But like we could continue to improve. We could improve even on, I think, the success we've had.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say the irony is we have a former Catholic because we have Alex Bernardo, but he's the host of the Protestant Libertarian podcast, which is really, it's not going to be very inviting for someone who's Catholic, maybe.
Yeah.
But he's also very ecumenical. So if we have any Catholic listeners here, you may appreciate his approach. He also has a lot of guests on who are not necessarily in libertarian world, but add a lot to biblical scholarship. So it's worth a listen. I'm gonna advocate for everybody at the Christians for Liberty Network, but definitely check everybody out.
Yeah. In terms of my next 100 episodes, man, I haven't even planned the next. I guess I've planned at least one more episode, but I haven't planned the next 99 episodes. But I don't know. Like on one hand, it's tough because I don't want to stay in one lane necessarily. But war is my number one issue, so it continues to be kind of like probably 3 or 4 out of every 5 episodes I do tends to be about war and foreign policy. But I also want to, so I think I started out and I was very much I'm focused on the theory, and then I kind of went on a like libertarian theory, connecting it to Christianity. Then I got deep into theology. Then I got deep into like practical politics. I think it's kind of time to go back to the theory, but I want to explain the theory not just in terms of like, so like I think as we as libertarians, there's the deontological libertarianism, and then there's like, for lack of a better word, the consequentialist libertarianism. And I haven't spent maybe as much time explaining that not only are our ideas right, but they work. And so I kind of want to do a lot more of that. Like your recent interview with, I forget her name, but the one who you were talking to her about a book that her organization published on drug addiction.
Jane Clark Miner, End It for Good.
Yeah. Yeah. So like how like a libertarian approach to addiction and drugs works, right? Like I do want to get more into that, because I think that's part of persuading more people to embrace liberty from a Christian perspective. Because people can be like, okay, you talk a good game, but like, how does this work in actual? Like that's part of the practical, right? Is not just the how do we get there, but like, what does that look like? So that's definitely something I want to look at. And I'll conclude by I want to give you one last question before we go here. Are there any topics you think? Because I gave you a focus on mine. Are there any things you think we at LCI maybe we've hit on, but that maybe me, you, or others that like maybe we need to be paying a little bit more attention to and talk about more in the in the next year or so?
I think I kind of have my the things that I like talking about and the way I approach it, and we all approach it a little bit differently. But I'm very interested in kind of the Bible as a big story, and kind of biblical theology in that sense. And the way that I think libertarianism emerges from that, or Christian anarchism, whatever you want to call it, I think is really important and maybe at times overlooked. I feel like we talk about 1 Samuel a lot, but the stuff on the powers of the principalities, what Revelation has to say about Babylon and about the beast. I think another thing that I'm maybe more inclined to emphasize than others, especially in conjunction with some of these conversations about immigration and stuff, but Pentecost. I mean, Pentecost is a really big part of that story, and it's about the kingdom of God reclaiming the nations from the powers and the principalities. And so I think when I I'd like to see more exploration of that story, that big story, and how kind of a Christian anarchism and a skepticism of the state and of these kind of artificial boundary lines. I'd like to see more of a conversation about how all that fits together within that big story.
I agree. That's good. And I don't know. Probably about the time this is coming out, we'll have done, or we'll be soon doing that a live stream presentation where we get into some of that. So people either go look for it coming up or in the past. Can't tell you which right now, but
to be clear on immigration, we're talking about, right?
On the immigration, which includes the talk about Pentecost and all that. So Cody, I appreciate you doing this with me. It was a lot of fun. And
anything for a fan, Jacob.
Boy, he's you're trying to sink your pacifistic Anabaptist claws into my reformed world. No, I appreciate it. One of my I guess the other thing, just to be a little cliche here at the end, like the friendships and relationships in this journey have been really fun too, and getting to know you more and have you on more. And you're the Watson to my Holmes, or I'm the Watson to your Holmes. I don't know which one of us is which in this, but
yeah.
But I appreciate it.
As long as it's not a Moriarty.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
I think the Scrappy Do It analogy was good. I think that works. I think you're
good.
The Scooby.
You're my Scrappy. You're the Scrappy to my Scooby. There we go. That works. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks, Cody, again for doing this with me. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Make sure you give this a thumbs up, subscribe, leave 5-star reviews. And episode 100. It's been a blast, and I look forward to the next 100. And until the next one, as I always conclude by saying, live at peace, live for Christ. Take care.
The Biblical Anarchy Podcast is a part of the Christians for Liberty Network, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. If you love this podcast, it helps us reach more with a message of freedom when you rate and review us on your favorite podcast apps and share with others. If you want to support the production of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, please consider donating to the Libertarian Christian Institute at biblicalanarchypodcast.com, where you can also sign up to receive special announcements and resources related to biblical anarchy. Thanks for tuning in.